The November frost clung to the windows of Macy's Herald Square like ghostly fingers, obscuring the view of bustling Broadway beyond. Thomas Whitmore pulled his wool coat tighter as he approached the employee entrance on West 34th Street, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The year 1910 had brought an unusually harsh winter to Manhattan, and even the steam radiators inside the great department store struggled against the bitter cold. Thomas had been working as Macy's head window dresser for 3 years, long enough to know every mannequin, every bolt of fabric, and every seasonal display by heart. At 28, he possessed an artist's eye and a craftsman's steady hands, qualities that had earned him respect among the store's management and envy from his colleagues. "Morning, Thomas," called out Margaret O'Sullivan, the seamstress, as she hurried past with an armful of silk evening gowns. "Mr. Henderson wants to see you about the Christmas displays." Thomas nodded, checking his pocket watch. 7:15. The store wouldn't open to customers for another 45 minutes, giving him precious time to assess yesterday's work and make any necessary adjustments. He climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the second floor, where the women's fashion department sprawled beneath electric chandeliers that cast warm yellow light across polished mahogany fixtures. The mannequin stood in the center window, draped in an exquisite burgundy velvet dress with pearl buttons. Thomas had positioned her there just yesterday afternoon, but something seemed different this morning. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Her face, carved from the finest European wax, possessed an unsettling beauty. High cheekbones, full lips painted in delicate rose, and eyes of startling blue glass that seemed almost too lifelike. The sculptor, as the mysterious artisan was known, had created this particular piece in 1902 for Macy's grand opening celebration. Unlike the other mannequins with their generic, pleasant expressions, this one had character, personality, almost as if— Thomas shook his head, dismissing the foolish thought. He'd been working too many late nights lately, that was all. But as he adjusted the mannequin's pose, rotating her slightly to better catch the morning light, he could have sworn her eyes followed his movement. A trick of the light, nothing more. "Beautiful work, isn't she?" Thomas spun around to find Mr. Henderson, the floor manager, standing behind him. Henderson was a portly man in his 50s with a neatly waxed mustache and the bearing of someone who took his position seriously. "Yes, sir. The sculptor certainly knew his craft." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "Strange fellow, that one. Came from somewhere in Eastern Europe, spoke broken English, created 6 mannequins for us, then disappeared without collecting his final payment. This one was his masterpiece." He gestured toward the figure in burgundy. "Named her Eleanor, he did. Said she was special. Eleanor." Thomas studied the mannequin's face more carefully. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them before. "Has she always been so realistic?" Thomas asked hesitantly. Henderson's expression darkened slightly. "You're not the first to notice. 3 window dressers before you mentioned the same thing," said. Her eyes seemed to follow them. "Nonsense, of course, but—" He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "Well, superstitious foolishness aside, she draws customers like nothing else. Sales in this section have increased 30% since we featured her prominently." Thomas nodded, though unease settled in his stomach like cold lead. As Henderson walked away, Thomas found himself alone again with Eleanor. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, cast different shadows across her face, and for just a moment, her expression seemed almost pleading. The electric lights flickered suddenly, a common occurrence in the still new electrical system, but the brief darkness sent a chill down Thomas's spine. When the light steadied, Eleanor's head appeared to have turned slightly, her glass eyes now looking directly at him. Thomas blinked hard, convinced his tired mind was playing tricks, but when he looked again, the mannequin's gaze hadn't wavered. Those blue glass eyes stared into his with an intensity that made his hands tremble as he reached for his tools. The morning rush began promptly at 8 o'clock, as fashionable ladies and working women alike flooded through Macy's grand entrance. Thomas tried to focus on arranging a display of winter coats, but his attention kept drifting back to Eleanor. Each time he glanced her way, she seemed to be watching him with those unnervingly lifelike eyes. "Excuse me, young man," a sharp voice cut through his concentration. Thomas turned to see an elderly woman in an elaborate feathered hat, her face flushed with indignation. Behind her stood a younger woman, presumably her daughter, looking embarrassed. "Yes, ma'am. How may I assist you?" "That mannequin," the older woman pointed a gloved finger directly at Eleanor, "has been staring at my daughter for the past 10 minutes. It's most unseemly." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but mannequins don't tell me what I didn't see." The woman's voice rose, causing other customers to turn and stare. My Clara was admiring the dress, and that thing kept watching her, following her movements with its eyes. "It's unnatural." The younger woman, Clara, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mother, please, you're making a scene." "I most certainly am not. That mannequin moved, I tell you." Its head turned to follow Clara as she walked past the window. "I've never seen anything so disturbing in all my years." Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air. "Mrs. Pemberton, Mrs. Gertrude Pemberton of Fifth Avenue." She spoke the address as if it should mean something to him. "Mrs. Pemberton, I assure you that our mannequins are crafted from wax and wire. They cannot move on their own." Even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt doubt creeping into his voice. "Then explain why it was looking right at us." Mrs. Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "My Clara has delicate nerves, and that thing has given her quite a fright." Thomas glanced at Eleanor, hoping to find some rational explanation. The mannequin's pose appeared exactly as he had arranged it that morning, yet something subtle had changed. Her head was angled differently, he was almost certain of it, and her expression seemed more alert somehow. "I'll speak to the manager immediately," Thomas said, hoping to calm the situation. "We'll have the mannequin inspected and repositioned if necessary." Mrs. Pemberton sniffed disdainfully, but seemed slightly mollified. "See that you do. Come along, Clara. We'll do our shopping at Lord & Taylor instead." As the two women departed, Thomas noticed several other customers had overheard the exchange. Whispers began circulating through the women's department, and more than one person cast nervous glances toward Eleanor. Margaret O'Sullivan appeared at his elbow. "What was that all about?" "Customer complaint about Eleanor," Thomas muttered, wiping perspiration from his brow with a handkerchief. "Claims the mannequin was watching her daughter." Margaret lowered her voice. "You know, I've heard other complaints this week. Mrs. Hoffman from the alterations department said 2 customers mentioned feeling uncomfortable around that particular mannequin. And yesterday, little Jimmy from the stockroom swore he saw it blink." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Blink?" That's what he said. "Course, Jimmy's only 14 and has quite the imagination, but still." Margaret glanced nervously at Eleanor. "There's something different about that one, Thomas. Always has been." Her crash echoed from across the floor as a customer accidentally knocked over a display of gloves. In the moment of distraction, Thomas looked back at Eleanor and gasped. The mannequin's head had definitely turned. Where moments before she had been facing slightly left toward the main aisle, now her gaze was directed straight at him. Margaret followed his stare and went pale. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," she whispered, crossing herself. "Did you see?" "I saw," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. His hands were shaking now, and he stuffed them into his pockets to hide the tremor. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me. Find out what you can about that mannequin's history. When it arrived, who made it, anything unusual about its creation?" Margaret nodded quickly, still staring at Eleanor with wide eyes. "Right away, Thomas. But be careful around that thing. I don't like the way it's looking at you." Thomas didn't respond because Margaret was right. Eleanor was looking directly at him now, her beautiful wax face tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity, or perhaps hunger. And unless he was losing his mind entirely, there was definitely more warmth in those glass eyes than any mannequin should possess. The basement archives of Macy's resembled a forgotten catacomb, filled with dusty ledgers, outdated inventory sheets, and forgotten remnants of the store's 8-year history. Thomas descended the narrow wooden steps, carrying a kerosene lamp to supplement the sparse electric bulbs that barely penetrated the gloom. The air smelled of old paper, mothballs, and something else he couldn't quite identify, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. Margaret had directed him to Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, the ancient record-keeper who had been with Macy's since its opening day. Thomas found the old man hunched over a desk in the far corner, his white hair gleaming in the lamplight as he meticulously entered figures into a massive leather-bound ledger. "Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas approached cautiously. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, from the window displays. I was hoping you could help me with some information about our mannequins." Blackwood looked up with rheumy eyes magnified by thick spectacles. His face was deeply lined like old parchment, and when he smiled, Thomas noticed several teeth were missing. "Ah, the window dresser. Yes, I've seen your work. Quite artistic." Blackwood's voice was barely above a whisper, forcing Thomas to lean closer. "What particular mannequin interests you, young man?" "The one called Eleanor." the wax figure created by the sculptor in 1902. Blackwood's expression changed instantly. His smile vanished, and his gnarled hands began to tremble slightly. "Eleanor," he repeated, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "You shouldn't have come asking about Eleanor." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "Why? What's wrong with asking about her?" "Sit down, boy." Blackwood gestured to a rickety chair beside his desk. "There are things about that mannequin that management prefers to keep quiet. But you have a right to know, especially if you're working with her daily." Thomas settled into the chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. Around them, shadows seemed to press closer, and he could swear he heard faint whispers echoing from deeper in the basement. Blackwood opened a different ledger, this one bound in black leather with tarnished brass corners. "The sculptor arrived in New York in early 1902, just months before our grand opening. Foreign fellow," spoke with a heavy accent. "Said he was from the Carpathian region, somewhere near Romania. Mr. Strauss hired him specifically to create unique display pieces that would set us apart from our competitors." The old man's fingers traced down columns of faded ink. "The sculptor worked in the basement, in a room we've since sealed off, spent 3 months down there, barely coming up for air. The other employees complained about strange noises at night, hammering when there should have been silence, and sometimes singing." "Singing?" "A woman's voice," they said. "Beautiful but melancholy, like someone mourning. But the sculptor lived alone, you see. No wife, no family, just him and his tools and whatever dark knowledge he'd brought from the old country." Thomas's mouth felt dry. "What happened to him?" Blackwood turned several pages, then stopped at an entry dated October 15th, 1902. "He delivered 6 mannequins, each more lifelike than the last, but Eleanor was special. He'd named her after Eleanor Ashworth, the socialite who'd gone missing during our opening celebration." "Missing? What do you mean missing?" "Beautiful young woman, barely 22, daughter of railroad money, engaged to a banker's son. She attended our grand opening party on October 18th, 1902, wearing a burgundy velvet dress that cost more than most people earned in a year." Blackwood's voice dropped even lower. "She was seen dancing with various gentlemen throughout the evening, but sometime after midnight she simply vanished. Never found her body, never found any trace of where she went." Thomas felt ice water flowing through his veins. "And the sculptor named his mannequin after her?" "More than that, boy. He claimed he'd captured her essence, her very soul in that wax figure. Management thought he was simply eccentric, you understand. Artists often speak in metaphors. But then strange things began happening." "What kind of strange things?" Blackwood closed the ledger with a soft thud. "Customers complained the mannequin watched them. Night security reported hearing footsteps from the display windows when the store was empty. And the sculptor himself, well, he grew increasingly obsessed with his creation. Spent hours talking to it, brushing its hair, adjusting its clothing. Said Eleanor was speaking to him, telling him secrets about the afterlife." A cold draft suddenly swept through the basement, extinguishing Thomas's lamp and plunging them into near darkness. In the faint glow of the electric bulbs, Blackwood's face looked like a death mask. "The sculptor disappeared 3 days after the mannequin was first displayed," the old man whispered. "Left behind all his tools, his other creations, even his final payment. Just vanished, like Eleanor Ashworth before him. And ever since then, that mannequin has been different." Thomas's hands were shaking as he relit the lamp. "Different how?" "She moves, boy. Not much, just subtle changes that make you question your own eyes. And she watches people, especially young men. There have been 3 window dressers before you, and all of them left suddenly claiming they couldn't work with Eleanor anymore. Said she was trying to communicate with them, trying to tell them something important." In the flickering lamplight, Blackwood's eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. "My advice to you, Thomas Whitmore, is to stay away from that mannequin. Eleanor Ashworth died in 1902, but something of her remains trapped in that wax and wire. And whatever she wants, it's nothing good for the living." Thomas couldn't concentrate for the rest of the day. Blackwood's revelations echoed in his mind as he mechanically adjusted displays and assisted customers. Every time he glanced toward Eleanor, he noticed something new: the slight tilt of her head, the way shadows seemed to gather around her form, the unnatural warmth that seemed to radiate from her wax skin. By closing time, most of the staff had departed, leaving only Thomas and Harold McNeil, the night security guard. Harold was a burly Irishman in his 40s who'd worked various jobs around the city before settling into his position at Macy's. He carried a heavy wooden club and a ring of keys that jangled with each step. "Working late again, Thomas?" Harold asked, making his rounds past the women's department. "Just finishing up the holiday preparations," Thomas replied. though in truth he was desperate to spend time alone with Eleanor to test whether Blackwood's stories held any merit. "Don't mind me, Harold. I'll be done within the hour." Harold nodded and continued his patrol, his footsteps echoing through the vast empty store. The electric lights had been dimmed to save on the electricity bill, leaving most of the floor in deep shadow. Only the window displays remained fully illuminated, casting pools of yellow light that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. Thomas approached Eleanor slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the dim light, she appeared even more lifelike, her pale skin seeming to glow with an inner luminescence. The burgundy dress clung to her perfectly proportioned figure, and her dark hair fell in elegant waves around her shoulders. "Eleanor," he whispered, feeling foolish even as the name left his lips. "If you can hear me, if there's any truth to what Blackwood told me, give me a sign." Nothing happened. The mannequin remained frozen in her pose, glass eyes staring serenely ahead. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Perhaps the old man's stories were nothing more than workplace gossip, embellished over the years until the electric lights flickered. Thomas held his breath as the illumination wavered, casting dancing shadows across Eleanor's face. For a moment her features seemed to shift, becoming softer, more human. Her lips, painted in that delicate rose color, appeared to part slightly as if she were about to speak. Then the light steadied and she was just a mannequin again. "My imagination," Thomas muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He stepped closer, studying her face intently. "You're beautiful, I'll give you that. The sculptor certainly knew his craft, but you're just wax and wire and glass, nothing more." A soft sound escaped from Eleanor's lips, so quiet Thomas almost missed it. A sigh, barely audible, filled with infinite sadness. Thomas stumbled backward, knocking into a display of silk scarves. "That's impossible," he gasped, but even as he spoke, he knew what he'd heard. Eleanor had sighed, a sound so human and heartbreaking that it made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "What do you want?" he whispered. This time Eleanor's head turned, not quickly, not obviously, but with the subtle movement of someone awakening from deep sleep. Her glass eyes focused on Thomas's face, and he saw intelligence there, awareness, and something else that made his blood run cold, desperate hunger. Her lips moved, forming silent words that Thomas strained to understand. The movement was so slight that anyone else might have dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Thomas was close enough to see the delicate muscles beneath her wax skin contracting and relaxing. "Help me." The words were barely a breath, so faint they might have been his imagination, but Thomas heard them clearly, felt them resonate in his bones like a tuning fork struck against glass. "Help you how?" Thomas found himself asking, no longer caring if he was losing his sanity. "What happened to you, Eleanor? What did the sculptor do?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, actual tears that rolled down her waxed cheeks, leaving glistening tracks in the painted surface. Her mouth opened wider, and when she spoke again, her voice was clearer, tinged with the refined accent of New York's upper class. "Trapped," she whispered. "He trapped me in here. The night of the party. He said he loved me, said he would make me immortal. I followed him to the basement and he did something to me. Bound my spirit to this form while my body—" Her voice broke into a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the wax shell. "Where is your body, Eleanor?" Thomas asked gently, surprised by his own compassion for this supernatural entity. "Hidden," she replied, her voice growing stronger, "in the sealed room where he worked, behind the eastern wall. My bones lie there still, dressed in this same burgundy gown. But my soul is here in this prison of wax." Thomas felt tears on his own cheeks. The tragedy of it overwhelmed him. A young woman's life cut short, her spirit bound to an artificial form for 8 long years, watching helplessly as life continued around her. "What can I do?" he asked. Eleanor's expression changed, becoming more animated, more hopeful. "Find my remains. Give me a proper burial. Break the connection that binds me to this mannequin. Only then can I find peace." Suddenly, Harold's heavy footsteps echoed from the main aisle. Thomas quickly wiped his eyes and stepped away from Eleanor, but not before he saw her mouth one final word: "Please." "Still here, Thomas?" Harold called out, his lamp casting long shadows as he approached. "You've been up here quite a while." Thomas looked back at Eleanor, but she had returned to her mannequin pose, glass eyes staring sightlessly ahead. Only the faint tracks of tears on her cheeks remained, as evidence of their supernatural conversation. "Just finished," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse. "I'll be heading home now." But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he knew there would be no sleep for him tonight. Eleanor's desperate plea echoed in his mind, and he found himself planning a return trip to the basement to find the sealed room where her earthly remains waited for someone brave enough to grant her eternal rest. Thomas waited until well past midnight before returning to Macy's. The November wind howled through the empty streets of Manhattan, rattling the windows of closed shops and sending newspapers tumbling like ghostly dancers across the cobblestones. He'd borrowed a set of lockpicks from his brother, a former locksmith, and carried a powerful electric torch along with his usual kerosene lamp. The employee entrance yielded easily to his picks, and Thomas slipped inside, his heart pounding with equal measures of fear and determination. The store felt different at this hour, not merely closed, but somehow holding its breath, as if waiting for something momentous to occur. Harold would be making his rounds on the upper floors, giving Thomas perhaps an hour to locate the sealed room Blackwood had mentioned. He descended to the basement, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the narrow stairwell. The basement seemed even more labyrinthine in the dead of night. Thomas oriented himself using the storage areas he recognized, then began searching the eastern wall for any signs of recent construction. Most of the basement walls were original brick, darkened with age and moisture, but after 20 minutes of careful examination, he found what he was looking for. A section of newer brickwork, perhaps 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, had been installed with different mortar, paler and less weathered than the surrounding masonry. Someone had tried to disguise the work by staining the new bricks, but to Thomas's trained eye the deception was obvious. He ran his hands along the wall, feeling for any weakness in the construction. The mortar was solid, but not professionally applied. This had been a rush job, meant to seal something away quickly and permanently. Thomas retrieved a crowbar from a nearby maintenance closet and began working at the edges of the sealed entrance. The newer mortar crumbled more easily than he'd expected, suggesting it had been mixed improperly in someone's haste to complete the work. After an hour of careful chipping, he had loosened enough bricks to create a small opening. A rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it an odor that made Thomas gag. The sickly sweet smell of decay mixed with something chemical and sharp. Formaldehyde, perhaps, or some other preservative. Thomas widened the hole until he could squeeze through, then played his electric torch beam into the darkness beyond. What he saw made his blood freeze. The room had been the sculptor's workshop, that much was immediately evident. Carving tools lay scattered across a wooden workbench, alongside bottles of mysterious chemicals and what appeared to be anatomical diagrams. But it was the far corner that drew Thomas's horrified attention. Eleanor Ashworth sat in a high-backed chair, exactly as she had died 8 years ago. Her body, dressed in the burgundy velvet gown that matched her mannequin counterpart, had been preserved through some unholy combination of chemicals and supernatural influence. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, but her features remained recognizable. The same high cheekbones, the same elegant nose, the same full lips that now hung slightly open in an eternal, silent scream. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. Unlike the glass orbs of the mannequin, Eleanor's real eyes had been removed, leaving empty sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at Thomas. On the workbench, he spotted a pair of blue glass eyes, perfect replicas that the sculptor had created for his wax duplicate. Thomas approached the corpse slowly, fighting nausea and an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Around Eleanor's chair, he noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden floor, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they bent light in impossible ways. A leather-bound journal lay open on the workbench. Thomas picked it up with trembling hands and read the final entries written in a spidery hand. October 20th, 1902. The ritual is complete. Eleanor's essence has been successfully transferred to the wax vessel. Her physical form remains here, preserved for eternity, while her spirit animates my greatest creation. She resisted at first, but the ancient binding grows stronger each day. Soon she will accept her new existence. October 22nd, 1902. Something has gone wrong. Eleanor's spirit is not adapting as the texts promised. She fights the binding, causing disturbances throughout the store. The wax figure moves on its own, and customers report feeling watched. I must find a way to strengthen the connection. October 24th, 1902. The police came asking questions about Eleanor's disappearance. I told them nothing, but suspicion grows. I have decided to seal this room and leave the city. Perhaps distance will weaken the binding and allow Eleanor to find peace. If not, may God forgive me for what I have done. Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking violently. The sculptor had murdered Eleanor Ashworth and trapped her spirit in a mannequin through some form of dark sorcery. For 8 years she had been imprisoned in that wax shell, watching helplessly as life continued around her. A soft sound made Thomas spin around. Eleanor's preserved corpse was looking directly at him, despite its lack of eyes. The empty socket seemed to bore into his soul, and her mouth moved silently, forming words he somehow understood without hearing. "Thank you for coming. Now you must free me." The temperature in the room plummeted, and Thomas's breath became visible in white puffs. The carved symbols on the floor began to glow with a faint, sickly light, and he realized he was witnessing the supernatural connection between Eleanor's body and her imprisoned spirit. "What do I need to do?" Thomas whispered. Eleanor's corpse raised one perfectly preserved hand and pointed to a silver amulet hanging around her neck, an intricate design that matched the symbols on the floor. "Break the amulet. Destroy the binding. Let my body return to dust, so my spirit may find rest." Thomas reached toward the amulet, but the moment his fingers touched the silver, pain shot through his arm like lightning. The workshop around him began to spin, and he heard voices, dozens of voices, whispering in languages he didn't recognize. The sculptor's ritual was fighting him, trying to preserve the unholy connection it had forged between life and death. Thomas gritted his teeth and grasped the amulet firmly, ignoring the agony that raced through his body. With a sharp tug, the silver chain snapped. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Eleanor's preserved body began to crumble, 8 years of decay compressed into mere seconds. Her beautiful features dissolved into dust. Her elegant gown fell apart like burnt paper, and her bones turned to powder that scattered in a sudden wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The glowing symbols on the floor flickered and died, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted, like a weight being removed from Thomas's shoulders. But from somewhere far above, in the women's department, came the sound of breaking glass and a woman's voice, Eleanor's voice, screaming in either agony or relief. The scream that echoed through Macy's seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Thomas dropped his torch and ran from the workshop, squeezing back through the hole in the wall with desperate haste. The sound of shattering glass continued from above, punctuated by what sounded like furniture being overturned and displays crashing to the floor. Harold's voice boomed from somewhere in the store. "Who's there? Show yourself!" Thomas raced up the basement stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering as Eleanor's anguished cries grew louder. Whatever was happening in the women's department, it was violent and supernatural, and he feared he had made a terrible mistake in breaking the binding. He burst onto the second floor to find chaos. Every piece of glass in the women's department had exploded. Mirrors, display cases, even the electric light bulbs hung in sparkling fragments from their fixtures. Mannequins had been knocked over, their limbs scattered across the polished floor like the aftermath of a massacre. In the center of it all stood Eleanor. Not the mannequin. That wax figure lay in pieces near the window, its beautiful face cracked down the middle, its glass eyes rolled into dark corners. This was Eleanor Ashworth herself, translucent and glowing with ethereal light, her burgundy gown flowing as if moved by an invisible wind. She was sobbing, great, heaving sobs that shook her spectral form. Her hands covered her face, and her dark hair whipped around her shoulders in the supernatural tempest that surrounded her. "Eleanor!" Thomas called out, approaching cautiously through the debris. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and Thomas saw that her eyes, her real eyes, not the glass replicas, were filled with tears of relief and gratitude. She was beautiful beyond description, more lovely in death than any wax sculpture could ever capture. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly despite its ethereal quality, "you freed me. After 8 years of imprisonment, you gave me back my voice, my movement, my ability to feel." Harold's heavy footsteps thundered up the main staircase. Thomas, are you up there? What in blazes is going on?" Eleanor's form flickered, becoming less solid. "He cannot see me as you do," she explained. "The living rarely perceive spirits clearly unless they possess sensitivity to the supernatural. But I must speak quickly. My time here grows short." "What do you need to tell me?" Thomas asked urgently. "The sculptor. His real name was Dmitry Volkov. He was not merely an artist, but a practitioner of the dark arts, driven from his homeland for trafficking with demons and the dead. He came to America seeking new victims for his experiments in binding souls to inanimate objects." Eleanor's form grew brighter, more agitated. "I was not his first victim, Thomas. In his workshop, hidden beneath the floorboards, you will find the remains of 3 other women, Immigrants who would not be missed, young women whose disappearances caused no investigation. Thomas felt sick. 3 others? He planned to create an army of animate mannequins, each powered by a trapped human soul. He believed such creations would make him wealthy beyond measure, display pieces that would draw customers through their supernatural beauty and presence. But something went wrong with my binding. My spirit was too strong, too resistant to his control. Harold burst onto the floor, his lamp casting wild shadows as he surveyed the destruction. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "Thomas, what happened here? It looks like a tornado hit the place." Thomas glanced at Harold, then back at Eleanor, who had become so translucent he could barely see her. "Tell me about the others," he whispered. Their names were Maria Santos, a seamstress from the Lower East Side, Catherine O'Brien, an Irish girl who worked in a laundry, and Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who cleaned offices at night. Eleanor's voice was fading, becoming distant. "They deserve proper burial, Thomas. Their families never knew what became of them." "Thomas!" Harold grabbed his shoulder roughly. "Who are you talking to? There's nobody there." But Eleanor pressed on, her form now barely visible. "There is one more thing you must know. Volkov's journal contains references to others like him, practitioners of this dark art who came to America seeking fresh victims. They called themselves the Collectors, and they are still out there, still binding innocent souls to fuel their unholy creations." "Where?" Thomas asked desperately. "Where can I find information about these collectors? The journal speaks of a meeting place, a warehouse in the 5 Points district. But be careful, Thomas. What you have done here tonight, freeing me, will mark you as an enemy to their kind. They will know what you have accomplished and they will come for you." Eleanor's image flickered one final time, becoming solid enough for Thomas to see her clearly. She stepped toward him and reached out as if to touch his face. He felt a sensation like cool silk brushing against his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me peace. For 8 years I lived in horror, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to rest. But now," a smile of infinite relief crossed her features, "now I can go to whatever lies beyond." A brilliant light suddenly filled the women's department, so bright that both Thomas and Harold shielded their eyes. When it faded, Eleanor was gone. The supernatural wind died away, leaving only the tinkling sound of settling glass fragments. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the women's department for 8 years finally lifted. Harold stared at Thomas with wide eyes. What in God's name just happened here? Thomas looked around at the destruction, evidence of Eleanor's violent liberation from her wax prison. Tomorrow, management would want explanations. The police might become involved. And somewhere in the 5 Points district, other collectors might already be learning of their colleagues' failure. "I think," Thomas said quietly, "that we just witnessed a miracle, a very dangerous miracle." But as he helped Harold begin the cleanup, Thomas's mind was already planning his next move. 3 other women deserved the same peace he had given Eleanor, and somewhere in New York, more collectors were likely preparing more victims for their unholy experiments. Eleanor was free, but Thomas's work was far from finished. 3 days passed before Thomas could return to the sealed workshop. The destruction in the women's department had caused an uproar. Management blamed a gas explosion for the shattered glass and overturned displays, while the insurance investigators scratched their heads over the lack of any actual explosive evidence. Thomas kept his mouth shut and helped with the cleanup, all while planning his return to the basement. Mr. Henderson had given him 2 days off to recover from the shock of discovering the destruction, which Thomas used to research the names Eleanor had provided. Maria Santos, Catherine O'Brien, and Anna Kowalski had indeed disappeared from the Lower East Side between 1901 and 1902. Their cases had received minimal police attention, 3 immigrant women with no powerful families to demand justice. Now armed with a proper lantern and more substantial tools, Thomas descended once again into the basement. The workshop felt different without Eleanor's preserved corpse, less oppressive but somehow more hollow, like a church after the congregation has departed. Thomas examined the floor where Eleanor had indicated the other bodies were hidden. The wooden boards were old and stained, but in one corner he noticed planks that didn't quite match the rest. They were slightly newer, installed hastily to cover something beneath. Using the crowbar, Thomas pried up the mismatched boards. The smell that rose from the hidden space made him gag, the sickly sweet odor of long-dead flesh mixed with the same chemical preservatives that had kept Eleanor's body intact. 3 wooden boxes lay side by side in the shallow grave, each about the size needed to hold a human body. Thomas's hands trembled as he lifted the lid of the first container. Maria Santos had been young, perhaps 18, with dark hair and delicate features. Like Eleanor, she had been preserved through Volkov's chemical process, but her body showed signs of the torture she had endured. Strange symbols had been carved into her forehead, and her hands were positioned in an unnatural pose that suggested ritual significance. Around her neck hung an amulet similar to the one Eleanor had worn, but this one was made of copper rather than silver. Thomas steeled himself and grasped it, ignoring the burning sensation that shot through his fingers. The amulet crumbled to dust the moment he applied pressure, and Maria's body immediately began its long-delayed decay. As her remains turned to powder, Thomas heard a whisper in the darkness. Not words, but a sound of infinite gratitude that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A cool breeze stirred the stale air, carrying with it the faint scent of roses, and Thomas knew that Maria Santos had finally found peace. The second box contained Catherine O'Brien, a red-haired girl who couldn't have been more than 16. Her body bore similar ritual markings, and a bronze amulet hung around her throat. Thomas destroyed this binding as well, listening to Catherine's spirit sigh with relief as her earthly remains crumbled away. Anna Kowalski, the third victim, had been the youngest, barely 15, with blonde hair arranged in elaborate braids. The sight of her preserved face, frozen in an expression of terror, nearly broke Thomas's resolve, but he forced himself to crush the iron amulet that bound her soul, setting her spirit free to join her companions in whatever lay beyond. As the last of Anna's remains turned to dust, Thomas noticed something else in her box, a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. With shaking hands, he unfolded Volkov's final message. To whoever discovers my work, the rituals detailed in my journal are but a fragment of the greater knowledge possessed by the collectors. We are legion, spread across this new world like seeds on fertile ground. Each major city harbors at least one of our kind, binding souls to serve our purposes, sometimes as animated mannequins, sometimes as vessels for other uses. The warehouse at 47 Mulberry Street serves as our New York meeting place. There you will find records of our activities, lists of potential victims, and instructions for more advanced bindings. But beware, the building is warded against intrusion, protected by spirits far more malevolent than those we create. Should my work be discovered and my bindings broken, know that my brothers will sense the disturbance. They will come seeking whoever has interfered with our sacred mission. Hide well, friend of the dead, for the collectors show no mercy to those who would free our carefully gathered souls. Thomas folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His hands were steady now, his purpose clear. Eleanor, Maria, Catherine, and Anna were at peace. But how many other innocent souls remained trapped in wax and wood and metal throughout the city? He gathered what remained of Volkov's journal and chemical supplies, then sealed the workshop once more. But this time, he used proper mortar and techniques that would hide the room for generations. Let future renovations discover only an empty space. The women's remains had been freed, their suffering ended. As Thomas climbed the basement stairs, he felt the weight of Eleanor's final warning. The collectors would indeed know what he had accomplished. His normal life was over, replaced by a calling he had never sought but could not ignore. Tomorrow he would quit his position at Macy's and begin hunting for the warehouse on Mulberry Street. The department store had been Eleanor's prison, but Thomas suspected it was only one link in a much longer chain of supernatural horror. The gaslight outside flickered as Thomas emerged onto 34th Street, and for a moment he thought he saw 4 translucent figures standing in the shadows, Eleanor and her 3 fellow victims, watching over him with expressions of gratitude and concern. "I won't let your sacrifices be meaningless," Thomas whispered to the empty street. "I'll find them all and I'll set them free." The figures smiled and faded into the night, but Thomas felt their blessing lingering around him like invisible armor. He would need all the protection he could get for what lay ahead. The 5 Points district in 1910 was a labyrinth of narrow streets, ramshackle tenements, and shadowy alleyways where honest folk feared to tread after sunset. Thomas made his way through the maze of humanity. Italian immigrants hawking vegetables from wooden carts, Irish laborers stumbling from taverns, Chinese merchants conducting mysterious business behind curtained doorways. The air reeked of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else Thomas was beginning to recognize, the subtle scent of supernatural corruption. He had spent 2 days preparing for this expedition, purchasing a used revolver from a pawn shop and studying maps of the district. The address from Volkov's note, 47 Mulberry Street, led him deep into the heart of the neighborhood, where legitimate businesses gave way to gambling dens and opium parlors. The warehouse stood at the end of a dead-end alley, its brick facade blackened with decades of soot and grime. Unlike the bustling buildings surrounding it, this structure seemed oddly quiet, as if sound itself avoided the place. No children played nearby, no vendors set up carts along its walls, and even the ever-present rats seemed to give it a wide berth. Thomas approached cautiously, noting the strange symbols carved into the mortar between the bricks, geometric patterns similar to those he had seen in Volkov's workshop, but more complex and somehow more menacing. The building's windows had been bricked up from the inside, leaving only dark rectangles that gave the facade the appearance of a giant skull. The main entrance was secured with multiple locks and chains, but Thomas had come prepared. His lockpicks made quick work of the restraints, though each click of tumblers falling into place seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As the door swung open, a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the now familiar scent of preservation chemicals and something else, the musty odor of ancient evil. Thomas lit his lantern and stepped inside. The warehouse's interior had been transformed into something resembling a bizarre museum. Dozens of mannequins stood in neat rows, each one frighteningly lifelike, each one bearing the subtle signs of supernatural animation that Thomas had learned to recognize. Their glass eyes seemed to track his movement as he walked between them, and more than once he could have sworn he heard whispered conversations from the wax lips. Against the far wall stood shelves lined with jars of preserved organs, bottles of mysterious chemicals, and bound volumes written in languages Thomas couldn't identify, but it was the center of the warehouse that drew his horrified attention. A massive table, stained dark with what could only be blood, dominated the space. Leather restraints hung from its edges, and surgical instruments lay scattered across its surface. Above it, suspended from the ceiling by iron chains, hung the partially completed form of what appeared to be a human figure constructed from various body parts. Thomas's stomach lurched as he realized he was looking at Volkov's ultimate creation, an artificial being assembled from the remains of multiple victims, waiting only for the final ritual that would bind a harvested soul to its patchwork flesh. A leather-bound ledger lay open beside the table. With trembling hands, Thomas began to read. November 15th, 1910. The New York chapter continues to prosper. Brother Marcus has completed 3 new bindings this month, including a particularly exquisite child soul bound to a porcelain doll for Mrs. Vanderbilt's collection. The wealthy of this city hunger for our unique artistry, though they know not the true source of their treasure's lifelike qualities. Brother Chen reports similar success with his jade figurines in Chinatown, while Sister Margot's music boxes have found favor among the Fifth Avenue elite. Each piece contains a fragment of harvested humanity, providing our patrons with entertainment that pulses with genuine emotion and awareness. The great work progresses. Soon we will have gathered enough bound souls to attempt the grand summoning. The ancient ones grow restless in their eternal prison, eager to walk among the living once more. Thomas flipped through more pages, his horror growing with each entry. The collectors were not merely eccentric artists, but servants of something far more sinister, entities they called the Ancient Ones, beings of immense evil that had been imprisoned in some otherworldly realm. A soft sound made Thomas look up from the ledger. One of the mannequins, a young woman with auburn hair and painted blue eyes, had turned its head to stare directly at him. "Help us," the mannequin whispered, its wax lips barely moving. "Please, help us all." Thomas realized with mounting terror that every mannequin in the warehouse was animated by a trapped human soul. Dozens of victims, perhaps hundreds, stood before him in neat rows, their spirits imprisoned in artificial bodies, while their real remains molded in hidden graves throughout the city. The auburn-haired mannequin took a jerky step forward, its movements constrained by the supernatural bindings that held it. "You freed Eleanor Ashworth," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. "We felt her liberation, her joy as she passed into the light. Can you do the same for us?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "There are so many of you. I don't even know where to begin." "The amulets," whispered another mannequin, this one portraying a young man in a naval uniform. "Each of us wears the binding that holds our souls, but these are different from the ones you destroyed before. Stronger, more complex." Thomas examined the nearest figures and saw that each indeed wore some form of jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, rings, or brooches made from various metals and set with strange gems that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The master crafters of each binding are listed in the ledger, the auburn-haired woman continued. You must find them and force them to release us. Only the one who created the binding can safely break it without destroying the soul within. A new voice spoke from the shadows near the entrance. How fascinating. I had wondered who was responsible for the disturbance at Macy's. Thomas spun around to see a tall, thin man in an expensive overcoat stepping into the warehouse. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and sharp features that might have been handsome, if not for the predatory intelligence in his pale eyes. "Allow me to introduce myself," the stranger said with a slight accent that Thomas couldn't place. "I am Marcus Blackthorne, senior collector for the New York territory, and you, my young friend, have caused us considerable inconvenience." The mannequins around Thomas began to move, their wax faces contorting with terror as Blackthorne approached. "Run!" the auburn-haired woman urged. "Run while you still can. He will bind your soul and add you to our number." But Thomas found he couldn't move. Blackthorne's pale eyes held him transfixed, and he felt his will draining away like water through a sieve. "Such a waste," Blackthorne murmured, pulling a silver amulet from his coat pocket. "You have the sensitivity to perceive the supernatural, a rare gift that would have made you valuable to our organization. But interference cannot be tolerated." The amulet began to glow with malevolent light, and Thomas felt something vital being drawn from deep within his chest, his very soul being pulled toward the cursed artifact. Thomas felt his life force being drawn inexorably toward Blackthorne's glowing amulet, like iron filings pulled by a powerful magnet. His vision began to blur, and a terrible coldness spread through his chest as something essential was torn from the very core of his being. Around him, the trapped mannequins watched in helpless horror, their wax faces contorted with sympathy for his plight. "Don't struggle," Blackthorne advised in a conversational tone, as if discussing the weather rather than committing supernatural murder. "The process is far less painful when you simply allow it to happen. Your soul will find a lovely new home. I'm thinking perhaps that empty mannequin near the eastern wall. She's been waiting for a suitable occupant." But as Thomas's consciousness began to fade, he felt something else stirring within him, a warmth that countered Blackthorne's cold extraction. The sensation grew stronger, and suddenly he realized he was not alone. Eleanor's spirit, along with those of Maria, Catherine, and Anna, had somehow attached themselves to him when he freed them. Their grateful souls were shielding him from Blackthorne's assault. "What?" Blackthorne's confident expression faltered as his amulet's pull weakened. "Impossible. No living soul can resist the grand binding once it has begun." "He's protected," whispered the auburn-haired mannequin, her painted features brightening with hope. "The freed spirits defend him. They haven't passed on. They've chosen to remain and fight." Thomas felt Eleanor's presence most strongly, her voice echoing in his mind. "Use our strength, Thomas. We give it freely to you, as you gave us freedom." Power surged through Thomas's body, not his own strength, but the combined will of 4 liberated souls who refused to let their savior fall to the same evil that had destroyed them. He broke free from Blackthorne's paralytic gaze and lunged forward, grabbing a heavy bronze candlestick from a nearby altar. Blackthorne snarled and raised his amulet higher, its silver surface now blazing with desperate intensity. "You cannot defeat me, boy. I have practiced the dark arts for over a century. I have bound hundreds of souls to my will." "But you've never faced souls that chose to be bound," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "These spirits fight with me willingly. That makes all the difference." He swung the candlestick at Blackthorne's outstretched hand, connecting with a satisfying crack. The collector screamed as his fingers snapped, and the silver amulet went flying across the warehouse floor, its malevolent glow guttering out like a snuffed candle. Immediately, the atmosphere in the warehouse changed. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on everything lifted, and the mannequins began moving more freely, no longer constrained by Blackthorne's dominating presence. "Kill him!" Blackthorne shouted, clutching his broken hand to his chest. "All of you destroy this interloper." But the mannequins did not obey. Instead, they turned toward their former master with expressions of long-suppressed rage. "We have no obligation to serve you without the grand binding," said the auburn-haired woman, her voice gaining strength and humanity with each word. "For the first time in years, we can choose our own actions." The mannequins began advancing on Blackthorne, their movements becoming more natural, more human, as their individual personalities reasserted themselves over the artificial constraints that had held them. The collector backed away, his pale eyes wide with genuine fear for the first time in decades. "Wait," Thomas called out, stopping the advancing figures. "If you destroy him, you'll never be free. He's the one who created your bindings. Only he can safely release you." The mannequins paused, their wax faces showing the internal struggle between vengeance and hope for liberation. Thomas approached Blackthorn, who had backed against the warehouse wall. "You heard them. They're willing to spare you if you release them. Break the bindings you've created." Blackthorn laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You naive fool. Do you think I would voluntarily destroy a century's worth of work? These souls represent power beyond your comprehension. With them I can live forever, young and strong, feeding on their life force." "Then you're choosing death," Thomas said quietly. "No," Blackthorn replied, pulling a small silver whistle from his coat pocket. "I'm calling for reinforcements." He blew a sharp, piercing note that seemed to cut through reality itself. The warehouse's sealed windows exploded inward, and through the openings came creatures that defied description, things of shadow and claw and burning eyes that moved with predatory grace. "The Ancient Ones send their servants when properly summoned," Blackthorn explained as the shadow creatures circled the warehouse. "They hunger for the taste of living souls, and you have just provided them with an excellent feast." The mannequins drew closer to Thomas, forming a protective circle. Their artificial bodies might not be able to harm these supernatural predators, but their trapped souls still retained the will to fight. Eleanor's voice spoke in Thomas's mind once more. "The ledger. Find the page that lists Blackthorn's personal binding, the one that keeps his soul anchored to his body. It will be written in his own blood, sealed with his true name." Thomas dodged a shadow creature's grasping claws and dove for the leather-bound ledger still lying open on the blood-stained table. He flipped frantically through the pages as chaos erupted around him, mannequins grappling with creatures of living darkness, while Blackthorn shouted commands in a language that predated human civilization. There, near the back of the book, written in crimson ink that seemed to pulse with its own life, Marcus Blackthorn's true name was revealed as Malakar the Soul Render, and beneath it, the complex binding ritual that had kept him alive and powerful for over 100 years. Thomas grabbed a lit candle from the altar and held it to the page. "Stop," he shouted. "Call off your creatures, or I burn this page and send your soul straight to whatever hell is waiting for you." Blackthorn froze, his pale face going even whiter. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Thomas replied. "I've already freed 4 souls tonight. What's one more?" The shadow creatures continued their assault, but Thomas could see uncertainty in Blackthorn's eyes. The collector was caught between his desire for power and his fear of true death. "Choose quickly," Thomas warned as the candle flame licked closer to the blood-stained page. "Freedom for these souls, or oblivion for yours." Around them the battle raged on, but Thomas held his ground, protected by the spirits of the women he had saved, and armed with the one weapon that could force a master of the dark arts to surrender, the threat of permanent destruction. Blackthorn's pale eyes darted between Thomas and the advancing shadow creatures, calculating odds that grew worse with each passing second. The flames from Thomas's candle crept closer to the blood-stained page containing the collector's true binding, and sweat beaded on the ancient sorcerer's forehead, despite the warehouse's supernatural chill. "You don't understand what you're threatening," Blackthorn said, his voice losing its confident tone. "These souls aren't just prisoners, they're batteries, power sources that fuel protections around this entire district. Without their energy, the barriers holding back far worse entities will collapse." "Lies," whispered the auburn-haired mannequin. "He speaks only to save himself." But Thomas noticed something troubling. As the candle flame drew nearer to Blackthorn's binding, the shadow creatures became more agitated, their forms writhing with increasing violence. The warehouse walls themselves began to vibrate, and a low humming sound filled the air, the sound of supernatural barriers straining under pressure. "The boy begins to understand," Blackthorn said, regaining some of his composure. "These bound souls serve a greater purpose than their individual freedom. They are part of a vast network that keeps the Ancient Ones locked in their dimensional prison. Release them, and you release horrors that will devour this entire city." Thomas felt Eleanor's presence wavering in his mind, uncertainty creeping into her spiritual voice. "Thomas, what if he speaks the truth? What if our freedom comes at the cost of thousands of innocent lives?" The flame was now touching the edge of the page, and Thomas could feel reality itself beginning to fray around the edges. Through the broken windows, He glimpsed shapes moving in the darkness, things far larger and more terrible than the shadow creatures already in the warehouse. "Choose quickly," Blackthorne pressed. "Burn that page and watch New York consumed by entities that have waited eons for their chance at revenge, or accept that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choice crushing down on him. But then another voice spoke in his mind, not Eleanor's, but Maria Santos, the young seamstress who had been Volkov's first victim. "There is another way," Maria whispered. "The bindings need not be destroyed, they can be transformed. Instead of chains that imprison, make them choices that liberate. We can choose to maintain the barriers while gaining our freedom to exist as we wish." Thomas opened his eyes, understanding flooding through him. "You're right," he said aloud, causing both Blackthorne and the mannequins to stare at him in confusion. "The souls don't need to be released. They need to be given choice." He moved the candle away from Blackthorne's page but did not extinguish it. Instead, he turned to the section of the ledger that listed all the bound souls in the warehouse. "I can't break your bindings," Thomas announced to the mannequins, "but I can change their nature. Instead of slavery, they become voluntary service. You maintain the barriers that protect the city, but you do so by choice, with the freedom to leave whenever you wish." Thomas began reading from the ledger, but instead of destroying the binding spells, he modified them, changing key phrases from commands to requests, from imprisonment to invitation. The candle flame, guided by Eleanor's spirit, burned away only the controlling aspects of each spell, while leaving the protective elements intact. The effect was immediate and profound. The mannequins gasped, actually gasped, as true breath filled their artificial lungs for the first time in years. Color flooded their wax faces, and their glass eyes gained the spark of genuine life. "We choose to stay," the auburn-haired woman said, her voice now fully human. "We choose to guard the barriers and protect the innocent, but we do so as free beings, not as slaves." One by one, the other mannequins echoed her declaration, their collective will reinforcing the supernatural defenses that kept the Ancient Ones at bay. The shadow creatures, sensing the renewed strength of the barriers, retreated through the broken windows with frustrated snarls. Blackthorne watched in stunned silence as his century of work was transformed in minutes. "Impossible," he breathed. "The bindings cannot be modified once they are set. The ancient laws forbid it." "The ancient laws," Thomas replied, still guided by the wisdom of the freed spirits, "say nothing about willing cooperation. These souls choose to serve. That makes them infinitely more powerful than your forced bindings ever could." He turned back to Blackthorne's page in the ledger. "Now it's your turn to choose. Release your claim on immortality and face whatever judgment awaits you, or watch me burn this page and send you to oblivion." Blackthorne's composure finally cracked completely. "Wait, please. I can offer you knowledge, power, wealth beyond imagination. The collectors have resources across the globe." "I don't want your resources," Thomas interrupted. "I want the names and locations of every other collector in your network. I want the rituals needed to free their victims, and I want you to swear a binding oath that you will never again traffic in human souls." The ancient sorcerer's face contorted with rage and desperation. "You ask me to betray everything I have worked for, to abandon power that makes me a god among mortals." "I ask you to choose between redemption and destruction," Thomas corrected. "The same choice you denied your victims." For a long moment, Blackthorne stared at the flame hovering over his binding. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders and spoke in a voice heavy with defeat. "I, Malakar the Soul Render, do hereby forswear the binding of unwilling souls. I release all claims to supernatural immortality and submit myself to the natural laws of mortality. I provide freely the knowledge of my fellow collectors and the means to free their victims." The words carried the weight of magical compulsion, and Thomas felt their truth resonate through the warehouse. Blackthorne aged visibly as he spoke, his silver hair turning white, his smooth skin wrinkling and sagging, as more than a century of borrowed time caught up with him. "The ledger contains everything you need," Blackthorne said, his voice now cracked with genuine old age. "Addresses, true names, binding rituals. But be warned, there are 12 other collectors in North America alone, and hundreds more across the world. Your work has barely begun." Thomas nodded, accepting the burden he had chosen to bear. Around him, the newly liberated mannequins smiled with genuine warmth, their artificial forms glowing with the light of free souls. "We will help," Eleanor's spirit whispered in his mind. all of us. We will guide you to our fellow prisoners and lend you our strength for whatever battles lie ahead." As dawn light began filtering through the broken windows, Thomas realized his old life as a window dresser was truly over. He was now something else entirely, a liberator of souls, a champion of the trapped and forgotten, and perhaps the only hope for countless victims waiting in supernatural bondage across the continent. The first phase of his mission was complete, but the greater work was just beginning. The morning sun streaming through the warehouse's broken windows revealed the full extent of Blackthorn's collection. Thomas spent hours cataloging the liberated souls, learning their stories, and recording the details of their imprisonment in a notebook he'd purchased specifically for this purpose. Each mannequin had a tale of betrayal, of trust violated by those who promised art or employment, but delivered only supernatural bondage. Blackthorn, now genuinely aged and frail, sat slumped against the warehouse wall, his transformation from ageless sorcerer to elderly mortal complete. The binding oath he had sworn prevented him from fleeing or warning his fellow collectors, leaving him helplessly cooperative as Thomas questioned him about the network's operations. "The collectors operate in cells," Blackthorn explained, his voice now a papery whisper. "Each major city has at least one, sometimes more. They masquerade as artists, antique dealers, museum curators, anyone with access to wealthy clientele who desire unique and lifelike pieces for their collections." Thomas consulted the ledger, his heart sinking as he read the extensive list. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, every major city in America harbored at least one soul trafficker, and many had multiple collectors working in coordination. "How do they communicate?" Thomas asked. "Through the bound souls themselves," Blackthorn replied. "The imprisoned spirits can sense each other across vast distances. When one cell creates a new binding, others feel the addition to the network. It's how they knew you had freed Eleanor and the others. The sudden absence created ripples throughout the entire system." Eleanor's voice spoke in Thomas's mind. "It's true. When I was trapped in the mannequin, I could sometimes sense others like me. The loneliness was indescribable. Imagine being surrounded by suffering souls, but unable to communicate, unable to comfort each other." Thomas made notes about the communication network, already formulating plans to disrupt it. If the collectors relied on their bound souls for long-distance coordination, liberating key figures could blind entire cells to each other's activities. "Tell me about the ancient ones," Thomas said. "What exactly are they, and how does the soul network keep them imprisoned?" Blackthorn's roomy eyes took on a distant look. "They are beings from before human civilization, entities of pure malevolence that once ruled this world. When humanity began to develop consciousness and free will, the ancient ones saw us as both a threat and a delicacy. They fed on suffering, on the anguish of sentient beings forced to act against their nature." The old collector coughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the warehouse. "A coalition of early shamans and mystics managed to bind them in a dimensional prison, but the barriers required constant reinforcement. The network of trapped souls provides that energy, their anguish and despair feeding the locks that keep the ancient ones contained. But now the souls choose to maintain the barriers," Thomas pointed out. "They're not suffering. So how can they still provide the necessary energy?" "Love," whispered the auburn-haired mannequin, who had introduced herself as Sarah Chen during their earlier conversation. "Love is more powerful than suffering, hope stronger than despair. We choose to protect the world because we love it, because we love the people in it. That willing sacrifice creates energy far more potent than forced anguish." Blackthorn looked surprised, as if this possibility had never occurred to him. Perhaps the ancient texts were wrong. Perhaps the barriers were never meant to be powered by suffering at all. Thomas felt Eleanor's spiritual presence grow stronger, along with those of Maria, Catherine, and Anna. The four women who had been his first liberation were becoming permanent companions, their grateful souls choosing to remain with him rather than passing on to whatever lay beyond. "We can help you identify the other cells," Eleanor said. "Through the network, we can sense where the greatest concentrations of trapped souls exist. Boston has at least 30 bound spirits, Philadelphia nearly 50, Chicago," her voice faltered. "Chicago feels like a wound in the world. Whatever they're doing there, it's far worse than simple mannequin animation." Thomas studied the ledger more carefully, paying special attention to the Chicago entries. The name Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann appeared repeatedly, associated with something called the Flesh Sculpture Project, and references to living buildings and architectural souls. "Zimmermann," Blackthorn said when Thomas asked about the name. He's the eldest of our kind, perhaps 3 centuries old. He doesn't content himself with simple mannequins or music boxes. His obsession is with binding souls to structures, making entire buildings that pulse with trapped consciousness. The thought made Thomas's skin crawl. Entire buildings. Hotels, theaters, mansions, structures that seem alive because they truly are. The souls provide not just energy, but awareness. Zimmerman's buildings can sense the thoughts and desires of their occupants, adapting to provide exactly what each person wants most. The wealthy pay fortunes for such personalized luxury. Thomas made detailed notes about Zimmerman and Chicago, marking it as a priority destination. But first, he needed to address the immediate situation. The warehouse full of liberated souls couldn't remain here indefinitely, and he needed to establish some kind of base of operations for his expanded mission. "What will you do now?" he asked the freed mannequins. Sarah Chen smiled, her wax features now warm with genuine humanity. "Some of us will remain here maintaining the barriers as we promised. Others wish to return to their families, to find some form of closure with the lives that were stolen from us. A few—" she glanced at several mannequins who had moved closer to Thomas. "A few would like to join your mission, to help free our fellow prisoners." Thomas felt both honored and overwhelmed by their offer. The prospect of facing the entire collector network alone had seemed impossible, but with allies who understood the supernatural forces at work, he might actually have a chance. "I accept your help," he said formally, "but I want you to understand, this won't be safe. The collectors won't simply surrender when we arrive. They'll fight and they'll use every dark art they know to stop us." "We understand," replied Jonathan Morris, a mannequin who had been bound in the form of a distinguished gentleman. "But we've already died once at their hands. What worse fate could they inflict on us now?" As the day progressed, Thomas helped organize the liberated souls according to their chosen paths. Some would indeed remain to guard the barriers, others would seek whatever peace they could find with their former lives, and 6 volunteers would accompany him as he hunted down the remaining collectors. By evening, Thomas had transformed from a simple window dresser into the leader of a supernatural resistance movement. The notebook in his jacket contained the locations of dozens of collector cells, the true names of their leaders, and detailed instructions for breaking various types of soul bindings. "Your first target should be Boston," Blackthorne advised, as shadows lengthened across the warehouse floor. "Brother Aldrich Crane operates there under the guise of an antique dealer. He specializes in binding souls to jewelry and small decorative objects. His collection is extensive, but not as heavily defended as some others." Thomas nodded, already planning his journey north. "What about you? What happens to a former collector who's lost his immortality?" Blackthorne managed a wan smile. "I suppose I'll discover what mortality feels like for the first time in over a century. Perhaps I'll find some way to atone for the evil I've done, or perhaps I'll simply die, as I should have long ago." As Thomas prepared to leave the warehouse with his new allies, Eleanor's spirit spoke one final time. "Thank you for showing us that chains can become choices, that slavery can become willing service. You've given us something more precious than freedom. You've given us purpose." The next phase of Thomas's mission would take him far from New York, into territories controlled by collectors who had decades or centuries to perfect their dark arts. But he no longer faced them alone. Armed with knowledge, protected by grateful spirits, and accompanied by souls who had already conquered death itself, Thomas stepped out into the night, ready to begin his war against the supernatural slave trade that preyed upon the innocent. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood outside Crane & Associates Fine Antiques on Boston's fashionable Beacon Hill, watching wealthy patrons enter and exit the elegant shop. Snow fell gently on the gaslit streets, muffling the sounds of horse-drawn carriages and early automobiles. The city felt different from New York, older, more reserved, but with the same underlying current of supernatural corruption that Thomas was learning to recognize. His 6 companions were invisible to mortal eyes but very real to Thomas's enhanced perception. Sarah Chen, Jonathan Morris and 4 other liberated souls flanked him, their spectral forms radiating determination and barely contained anger. Over the past weeks, they had developed into an efficient team, each spirit contributing unique abilities to their supernatural investigations. "I can sense at least 20 bound souls inside," whispered Maria Santos, her ghostly voice carrying clearly to Thomas's ears. "They're in pain, Thomas. Such terrible pain." Eleanor's spirit, stronger than ever after weeks of willing cooperation, moved closer to the shop's windows. The collector is inside. I can feel his aura, cold and ancient, like winter given human form. But there's something else, something that doesn't belong to him. Thomas frowned, studying the building more intently. Through the large front windows, he could see displays of jewelry, small sculptures, and decorative objects that possessed the telltale signs of soul-binding. Too lifelike, too aware, too present in a way that made ordinary antiques seem dead by comparison. What else do you sense, Eleanor? Another presence, younger, frightened, recently bound. A new victim, trapped so recently that the binding hasn't fully set. Eleanor's spiritual form flickered with urgency. Thomas, if we act quickly, we might be able to save them before the ritual becomes permanent. This changed everything. Thomas had planned to observe the shop for several more days, learning Crane's patterns and defenses before making his move. But if someone was in the process of being bound, every moment of delay meant more suffering for an innocent soul. Sarah, can you and Jonathan scout the building's interior? I need to know how many people are inside and where Crane is conducting his ritual. The two spirits nodded and passed through the shop's walls like morning mist. They returned within minutes, their spectral faces grim. Crane is in the basement with a young woman, Sarah reported. She's still alive, but barely conscious. The binding ritual is perhaps half complete. Her soul is being slowly extracted and transferred to a silver music box. There are two mortal assistants with him, both armed. The ground floor has 3 customers browsing, Jonathan added. Ordinary people who have no idea what they're shopping for. The bound souls are scattered throughout the displays. Jewelry, small statues, music boxes, even a few pieces of furniture. Thomas checked his pocket watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. The shop would close at 6, giving him less than 2 hours to plan and execute a rescue that would also liberate 20 trapped souls without endangering innocent customers. We go now, he decided. Eleanor, I need you to create a distraction that will clear the customers without causing panic. Sarah and Jonathan, help me locate all the bound objects so we can identify them quickly. The rest of you watch for Crane's assistants. If they try to interfere, confuse them, lead them away from the basement. Thomas straightened his coat, checked the modified tools and supplies he'd acquired for breaking soul bindings, and walked confidently through the shop's front door. A bell chimed his arrival, its tone somehow sadder and more mournful than any bell should sound. "Good afternoon, sir," called a well-dressed clerk from behind the main counter. "Is there anything particular you're looking for today?" "Just browsing," Thomas replied, his eyes already scanning the displays for items that radiated the distinctive aura of imprisoned souls. "I collect unique pieces. The more unusual, the better." As he moved through the shop, Eleanor's spirit began her work. Lights flickered at odd moments, causing customers to look around nervously. A music box began playing on its own, its melody heartbreakingly beautiful and filled with such longing that one elderly woman began crying without understanding why. "Perhaps we should return another time," one customer murmured to her companion. "The atmosphere here is quite unsettling today." Within 10 minutes, the ground floor was empty, except for Thomas and the increasingly nervous clerk. Thomas approached the counter with a friendly smile. "I understand, Mr. Crane occasionally has special pieces available for serious collectors," he said, using a code phrase from Blackthorn's notes. "Items with particularly lifelike qualities." The clerk's demeanor changed instantly, his professional courtesy replaced by calculating assessment. "Mr. Crane is currently occupied with a private commission, but if you'd care to wait, I'm sure he'd be interested in discussing our more exclusive inventory." "Actually," Thomas said, pulling out a small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of gold coins, "I'm specifically interested in recently completed works. I find that fresh bindings have a certain vibrancy that older pieces sometimes lack." The clerk's eyes widened at the mention of bindings, terminology that only someone connected to the supernatural trade would use. I'll fetch Mr. Crane immediately. Please wait here." As soon as the clerk disappeared through a door marked private, Thomas began moving through the shop with purpose. His spectral companions guided him to each bound object, and he quickly identified the items that would need attention. 17 pieces of jewelry, 2 small sculptures, and a magnificent grandfather clock that seemed to tick with the rhythm of a human heartbeat. The bound souls within the objects sensed his presence and began reacting. Gems flickered within a light, metal surfaces grew warm to the touch, and the grandfather clock's hands began spinning wildly as the trapped spirit tried to communicate its desperation. Thomas was examining a particularly ornate silver locket, when heavy footsteps thundered up from the basement. Aldrich Crane burst through the private door, his appearance exactly matching Blackthorn's description: tall, gaunt, with prematurely white hair and eyes like chips of Arctic ice. "You!" Crane snarled, recognizing immediately what Thomas represented. "You're the one who destroyed our New York operation. Blackthorn told us someone had developed the ability to modify bindings, but I didn't believe such a thing was possible." Behind Crane came two burly assistants, both carrying the kind of heavy tools that would be more at home in a butcher shop than an antique store. "Release the woman you're binding," Thomas said calmly, though his heart was racing. "And I'll make your transition to mortality as gentle as Blackthorn's was." Crane laughed, a sound like breaking icicles. "Mortality? You think I fear death after 3 centuries of life? I have contingencies you cannot imagine, protections that will preserve my essence even if you destroy my physical form." The temperature in the shop plummeted, and frost began forming on the windows. Crane was drawing power from his bound souls, using their trapped energy to fuel supernatural attacks. But Thomas had learned much in his weeks of preparation. "Eleanor, now!" he called out. Eleanor's spirit, along with the other freed souls accompanying Thomas, suddenly became visible to everyone in the shop. Their spectral forms blazed with righteous fury as they moved to intercept Crane's mystical assault, their freely given energy countering his stolen power. "Impossible," Crane breathed. "The dead cannot manifest in the physical world without bindings to anchor them." "They're not bound," Thomas explained, beginning to work on the silver locket's binding. "They choose to be here. They choose to fight. That makes them infinitely more powerful than your enslaved souls could ever be." The locket's imprisoned spirit, a young seamstress named Rebecca, gasped with relief as Thomas modified her binding from slavery to freedom. She immediately joined Eleanor's group, adding her strength to their supernatural battle against Crane's defenses. One by one, Thomas worked through the shop's inventory, transforming chains of bondage into willing cooperation. Each liberation weakened Crane while strengthening the growing assembly of freed spirits. The 2 mortal assistants fled when the grandfather clock's liberated soul manifested as an elderly gentleman who began chasing them with spectral fury. "Stop!" Crane commanded, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The shop's temperature was returning to normal as his power base crumbled. "You don't understand what you're doing. These souls are part of something larger, a network that maintains the very fabric of reality." "I understand perfectly," Thomas replied, working on the final bound object, a music box that contained the partially extracted soul of the woman in the basement. "And I know that willing guardians are always stronger than enslaved prisoners." As the music box's binding transformed, Crane made one last desperate assault, lunging at Thomas with a silver dagger inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But Jonathan Morris intercepted the attack, his spectral form somehow managing to deflect the physical blade. The woman from the basement stumbled up the stairs, alive but weak, her soul safely returned to her body. She stared in wonder at the assembled spirits, tears streaming down her face as she realized she had been saved from a fate worse than death. "It's over, Crane," Thomas said quietly. "Renounce your immortal bindings and accept the natural span of human life, or face the judgment of the souls you've tortured for 3 centuries. Surrounded by dozens of freed spirits, their ghostly faces alight with justice long delayed, Aldrich Crane finally acknowledged his defeat. Like Blackthorn before him, he spoke the words that released him from supernatural power and returned him to mortality. As dawn broke over Boston, Thomas stood in the antique shop, surrounded by grateful souls and liberated artifacts. The woman Crane had been binding, a seamstress named Patricia Wells, was safely reunited with her body and her freedom. Some of the newly freed spirits chose to remain with Thomas, expanding his supernatural allies. Others opted to seek peace in whatever lay beyond the mortal world. All were finally free to make that choice for themselves. "Where to next?" Eleanor asked as they prepared to leave Boston. Thomas consulted his notebook, studying the extensive list of collector cells that still operated throughout North America. The war against supernatural slavery was far from over. Indeed, it was just beginning. "Philadelphia," he said, "then Chicago and Dr. Zimmerman's architectural abominations." As Thomas and his growing army of liberated souls departed Boston, leaving behind another empty collector stronghold and another group of freed prisoners, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that November morning when he first noticed Eleanor's eyes following him through Macy's window. He was no longer Thomas Whitmore, window dresser. He had become something new, a liberator of souls, a breaker of chains, and perhaps humanity's best hope against the ancient evils that fed on suffering and despair. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but Thomas faced it with growing confidence. Evil might be ancient and powerful, but it could not withstand the combined force of love freely given and justice long delayed. In the end, that would make all the difference.